Oh my God, I can't remember that guy's name. Um, Alex Narasta. I don't know how to say his name. Sounds like a crazy name, but I'm gonna hate both of them, and it should be a fun time. But for now, let's talk to Owen McDonald. Can you hear me?
Hello?
Rutro. Let me get some music playing. Oh, there you are.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. What's up?
Nice, how are you? All right? Can you see me now as well, hopefully?
Yeah.
Awesome, excellent. How are you? All right?
You know, listen, I'm doing great. I'm not going to lie. I saw your profile picture, and
Yeah.
from the lighting of your profile picture, you look very white. And you are
Really?
surprisingly not white in in camera, which is fine. You know what I mean? Like I don't care. Like obviously, please don't Michael Jackson yourself or anything. No skin cream to change it. But the profile picture was deceitful, and we're off to a bad start.
Really? I mean, I must say, you're the first person who's ever said that picture looks white. I must say. It's a curious one. Is it really that light in the
Well,
picture?
see, I'm American, right? So we're all a little admixture over here. There's no racial purity in America. As much as the people on Twitter love to beg to differ, let's be honest, everybody is a little bit mixed over here in America if you've been over here for a couple
But it's
generations.
human history, right? There's no such thing as a pure. There's no. Everyone's a bit of everything, aren't they? So. But no,
I remember.
It's an old picture now.
Yeah, I was just teasing a little bit. I remember I was arguing online years and years ago with this white supremacist who was like, I'm British, blah, blah. And I was like, okay. He's like, I'm 100% British. And I was like, cool. Are you like 100% Anglo-Saxon, 100% like Norman? Are you 100% Gallic? Are you 100% Druidic? Like which of these cultures that makes up the white identity are you 100%? And he was like, what the fuck are you talking about? I was like, yeah, like you were just kind of there for a long time, and then that identity gets formed around like successive generations and a culture. And I agree, as a conservative, homeostatic property clusters, that like race plays some element to that, but also like, what do you mean I'm 100%? Like, what is this math equation you're trying to put into this? Like, what the fuck are you talking about?
No, it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, people like that who are really fixated on some ethnic purity and some distilled, my bloodlines are completely 100% of one nation. Like, it's ridiculous. Like, it doesn't have any basis in actual lived history, and it's silly too. Like, why would you? Something like that, which is just chance, really. Like, you can't control where you're born or who your family is, right? Like, you should be proud of what you do in real life, not something that happened thousands of years ago, potentially.
To give the devil his due for the white identitarians, as well as for like all the critical race theory lefties, right? I would say that there is a heuristic, or like a correlation between like race and culture, right? And so like I don't think it's necessarily wrong or problematic to be proud of your culture or your heritage in some capacity, and that is going to have a certain element of race to it. Like, you can't be proud to be Polish without being proud of what Polish is, which is white, right? Like you can't, you know what I mean? So I do think that there is some element to that, but I think it's one of those things where the left believes that it must be completely gone in society, and like that's wrong, right? Like there needs to be some level of recognition of heuristic of what culture is, what behavior is, and things of that nature. But at the same time, because of that swing, I think you have this right wing that is like ascendant with like just this, that pendulum swing of like completely going way too fucking far with it.
Well, I suppose where we find that farness and sort of where we place the importance of culture may differ. It'd be interesting to come onto it a bit later, actually, because that's an interesting topic. But
yeah, we're here for a reason.
For a very long time. Yeah, no, exactly. I caught the.
There's no moderator.
I was listening to.
There's no moderator, so I'm just like I just vibe it. We're live streaming.
A chill conversation, right?
Yeah, I was just trying to get to know you a little bit. Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, you don't seem like the it seems a bit silly calling myself like a YouTuber or anything. I'm just essentially just some random person, basically. You know, I find conversation interesting, um, and so you know when as I caught the last minute or so of what you were saying before I joined the stream, and you summed it up quite nicely. You know, I saw bits of your video. I thought, don't quite agree with this. Left a comment. You left a reply. I left a reply, and I thought there's a chance this could go on for like 500 comments.
Yeah. Like
why not just speak directly, right?
I have, as a YouTuber, I have realized that when it comes to Twitter or YouTube comments or anything like that, it's like if there's a disagreement and you get a paragraph and then you give a paragraph back and then they give another paragraph, it's like stop, because you have completely lost whatever audience you think you have. Like at this point, everyone is like, that's cool, I'm not reading that shit. And now it has just become a like burdensome conversation via texting or typing with one other person and no audience. It just essentially becomes a waste of my time, both as a person and a content creator, when I can just have a conversation, get more information out in a smaller amount of time, and also monetize you, you know? So here we are.
Indeed. Also, YouTube is very unreliable. Like I find often I'll type out something and post it, and then it's vanished, just gone,
It's gone.
just
Yeah.
disappeared.
You said the wrong keyword. You said the wrong keyword, and the AI like just gets rid of it.
Indeed, and especially when you put a little bit of, because if it's like just you said like hi or something, it's not such a big deal. You can post it again. If you've put a bit of thought into something you've typed out, and then it's just struck off, just gone, it's infuriating. You know?
As we're speaking, someone in live chat. hold on. Vivi goes, what did he say? YouTube censors the fuck out of comments, and then my chatbot immediately deleted the comment because it's cursing. Oh, it's funny. Exactly what we're talking about.
Yeah, it was welfare, wasn't it? Yeah, okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I think for me, because I'm coming at this, I think you said that I'm a communist. I wouldn't quite call myself that, but definitely that sort of trajectory. Like I definitely would say I have a critique, of capitalism, which is quite fundamental to its operations. I think society needs to change quite a bit from what we're seeing at the moment. But I'd like to say I'm a pragmatist. I'd like to say that I exist in the here and now. Like I'd rather do things now to help people, even if it's a small way or a big way, than idealize and prophesize about something that's going to potentially take a longer time.
So I mean, like if we're only reading Marx, then I guess that would make you like not a traditional communist, right? But if we're reading Engels or Mao or Lenin or Stalin, right? You know the kind of the beginning classical communists, they would all agree with that sentiment, right? I mean, like if you're reading like Engels' Socialism, Scientific and Utopic, right? Describing in kind of more layman terms the concept of the dialectical materialism or historical materialism or historical dialectic, whatever fucking term you want to use, right? They would say like, like he describes, where does capitalism come from? Capitalism comes from, an inherent contradiction between, the nobility, the oppressor, right? And the peasantry. And that contradiction cannot exist in reality for too long because, and we saw this with the Industrial Revolution, with the creation of a merchant class. And so there is that kind of that dialectic of in the here and now, there is this miniature revolution, and capitalism is that miniature revolution that is, dealing with the contradictions that can no longer maintain the order of the society so that the ruling class can maintain order. They create the capitalist class. So, I mean, like if you're saying like, oh, well, I'm a pragmatist and I want to change society in a meaningful way in the here and now that gets us closer to, no private property, no capitalism society. That's just Marxism, right? Like that's just communism. That's just communism in reality, as opposed to communism in like a little red book Discord server where they're, complaining about the fact that you misgendered the furry, right?
Well, I mean, come on to misgendering another time, but in terms of, I get what you're saying there, right? Like, obviously, there's a lot of overlap between me saying that pragmatism is what I want, right? Like I want things to get better. And yeah, that betterness is coming in the form of moving away from right-wing economic systems and moving away from a capitalist mode of economy.
Hmm.
But what I more mean, I think, bringing us back to like welfare and stuff, or not bringing us back to, leading us into welfare. I think that for me, I want people just in general to be able to live and thrive and exist in a way that isn't going to give them hardship through in needless ways. And so when we think about what welfare is and what it does and what the
Uh-huh.
welfare systems and sort of state and all the functions of society that exist in what we would potentially call welfare, they exist in reaction to our capitalist system. They exist because someone said the current market will not provide enough for people to live or access or not give access to people who are not rich enough to afford the goods they need to survive. And so someone
Hmm.
said, actually, we're going to put things into a consensus, a collective, a government organized program that will say, okay, no one's going to go without food, no one's going to go without housing and such. And to
Hmm.
me, that is a big turning point from centuries of fairly, brutal, unlivable conditions where, as you've just said, peasants basically
Hmm.
um, had a pretty rotten time. The Industrial Revolution happened and people moved en masse to the cities, and living in those cities was dire.
Hmm.
And right up until really, like, we're in the 20th century, really, until it starts being properly formalized. In my country, most of the welfare state comes after the Second World War. And then you see a huge upturn in living quality and living standards. People start living beyond just their working years. People start thinking, oh, we can put all these resources to good use, and you get the huge improvement in quality of life from I don't know, early 20th century to today, pretty much, where
Hmm.
whilst there are still issues, and certainly there's major problems in society, the average person you're in America, right? You're in
Yeah, I'm
the
in America.
US. Average person in America, average person in Britain, in most of the Western world, isn't probably going to die of a preventable disease, isn't going to starve to death, isn't going to have various hardships.
Hmm.
However, the welfare state, and I'll finish in a second because I'm aware that I'm speaking. I don't want to stop you from talking too often. The welfare state comes under criticism because it's got its flaws, but they aren't an inherent fault of it. The person who said we need to help people wasn't the person at fault. It's the people who've come after them that have either funded various public sector things or have taken away the capacity of various public sector functions to help people, or it's the wider economy, which ultimately is based on some fairly flawed ideals and logics, which eventually
Yeah.
lead to
So there's a lot
societal
here.
problems. You go ahead, sorry. You go ahead.
Yeah. So there's a lot here. So in the beginning, I was with you, right? Um,
Yeah.
I would say, in summary to what you're talking about, so first and foremost, let me state, I have no problem with voluntary welfare. I think voluntary welfare is a necessary component to a functional society. I think when people fall on hard times, right, or you know, circumstances occur that are unpredictable or unlikely, but given enough iterations, they happen to someone, right? Someone somewhere gets a workplace accident, or someone somewhere gets a non-Hodgkin's lymphoma out of nowhere, right? Like these are things that are predominantly unpredictable in terms of happening in your individual life, and saving up for these things um, isn't necessarily like economically feasible for most people in any type of system, because they don't happen to everybody, right? They only happen to a small portion of people, but when they happen to those people, it can be devastating. So I'm not against welfare as a voluntary means of association and helping people, or people choosing to band together collectively to be their brother's keeper when those things occur. What I am against is state-based welfare, and I think that state-based welfare has been one of the greatest disasters economically and in terms of its actual long-term impact. Like, we can look at individuals. So like you talked about, I think you really made one huge misappropriation here, which is, after World War II, economic conditions or material conditions for the poor and the middle class, rose exponentially. And then you kind of made this argument, well, then this must be welfare, or that these two things are correlated. I don't want to be like that Reddit guy that's like causation doesn't equal correlation, right? But I kind of have to be in this moment. I don't think welfare is what caused those things. And I think the data, if we start packing it apart, at least from an American perspective, I'm not as familiar with, UK's systems and data and things like that. Will help illuminate that. And so, you talked about how capitalism and these inherent values and these things are wrong, but you didn't name any of the things, right? So I want to, like when we go into this conversation, I want to play this, kind of this game of specificity, which is name the trait, right? If all of these things are inherently wrong or bad, what these foundational aspects of capitalism per se, then what is that and why is it bad? And I think there is where we will have probably our greatest philosophical differences. But in terms of just a consequentialist analysis, right? Just doing an internal critique from your perspective of like, increasing, positive rights, right? Access to opportunity, access to school, access to healthcare, things of that nature. I don't disagree in any way, shape, or form that welfare has provided those services to people that may not have otherwise had those services. My disagreement is that what would that money have done in a free economy? And just because we can measure those short-term gains in like, we intentionally put money to give people healthcare and now they have healthcare, therefore good, right? I think is a false analysis because it doesn't compare it to what would have been otherwise, A, and B, there is there seems to be a lack of understanding of the long-term effects of those things, like welfare recidivism, how long people stay on welfare, whether or not their lives actually find meaning or purpose, or whether or not they end up in a welfare trap where this incentive structure is to maintain poverty, it's the same thing with healthcare, right? Like you don't see a lot of genetic testing so that we can find what diseases you have, so we know what food for you to avoid. It's all maintaining your poor health, right? And then giving you a new drug and giving you a new thing. So it's really a high time preference, low time preference thing, a philosophical disagreement. And then I just kind of reject the historical argument that welfare is the reason for those gains that were seen in the mid 20th century.
Okay, so let's start with that point actually. So we'll the historical argument. So it's an interesting point because you're right. There's more factors to the post-war boom, right? The war ends. America, in particular, has got a burgeoning industrial sector. You've got the boom years. Absolutely, it's not just the welfare sector. I think the crucial intervention, though, the sort of point that sticks out for me at least, is that before you couldn't access these things unless you had the resources, and after, the welfare state ensures that people had the foothold to be able to access housing, healthcare, transportation.
Why are we dealing with the null though? Right? Like it feels very much like when you're having a conversation about abortion and it's like we only bring up rape and incest, and it's like, sure, like that's a thing to talk about, but it's a small portion, right? So like when we're talking about welfare, you say unless they had the resources, and then you said these things. Now I don't know about the UK, but in America, somewhere close to 1 in 6 men. Sorry, hold on, let me look up my data actually. Sorry, I'm thinking 1 in 6 because it's 1 in 26 for a specific fraternal society. Something like 1 in 3 men were in a fraternal society that were covering healthcare needs, unemployment insurance needs. I don't know what you mean by these things, so I'm kind of guessing at the things, which are things that are often covered by welfare in fraternal societies. And the average amount of money that they were paying for healthcare and for unemployment insurance and for insurance for, going on work. I can't think of the term when you get injured at work, like workman's comp or whatever. They were paying roughly 1 week's wages for the year for that service. So it was much cheaper, and they had access to these things in an economy that was admittedly far more impoverished and far less wealth in general, because wealth has been kind of created over time, right? So like, I don't understand why we're dealing with the null. Why are we dealing with just the kind of bottom tier that can't scrounge together a week's salary for a yearly thing?
Our central point, right? The people who didn't have resources and then found they were able to exist in a healthier state after the intervention of the welfare state is the central argument, right? We are able we have been able through the welfare system to allow people to live and be healthy and happy. And then when you have more people in that category, you're able to see an increase in production, happier, healthier people, either expansion of various sectors of society, industry, electronics, the arts, etc.
Again, this is
because you've got more people going into it.
You're not connecting them. You're giving a hypothesis, but you're not giving any evidence for the hypothesis. The hypothesis that you're giving is, if we divert money from the economy and give it to the destitute, the poor, the sick, the elderly, etc., then we will get an increase, like a return on investment, if you will, of, all of these other industries. And then your evidence appears to be, well, we did these things and then they went up, therefore it is proven correct. But you also admit that like a univariate analysis makes no sense here, and you don't have a control group. You don't have anything to compare it to, which is a world without welfare, a world that went through the Industrial Revolution and went through World War II, right? That had a purely capitalistic framework. The best thing that we have to compare it to is fraternal societies in the turn of the century, which were far more effective at being able to provide these resources.
The prior existence of people before the welfare state was not very good for the majority of people. I mean,
without a doubt,
Industrial Revolution left pretty dire urban areas and inner city areas. Poverty was quite high in many cities. You look at the levels of poverty in many of these places. Big industrial cities. I'm British, so I'm sort of thinking British cities.
Right.
It's the case anywhere where there's been industrialization. Pre-welfare state, you have these essentially, slums, you might call them, right? Like really poor housing, rat infested. There's no access to many of the things we take for granted now. Then the governments and states introduce a welfare system, and there's an upturn. Now, you're quite right. Technically, there has not been a society where there is pure 100% no state whatsoever. Capitalism is, reigns supreme.
Yeah, it's like super rare. Maybe like you can like look at maybe like the Republic of Cospaya, but that's like a couple hundred people. And currently we have Prospera in Honduras. But they're doing really well, though.
You can see, though, that where the welfare state is reduced, where the neoliberal turn, the introduction of austerity and of various cutbacks on the welfare system, suddenly the improvements we see to human development and human prosperity, they start to decline. Suddenly we see the gains made post World War II start to shrink, and in some cases recess. In my country, the UK, many of the quality of life measurements that you might look at are declining, it's shocking, because you'd think a country that's quite wealthy, quite affluent like the UK, you think it would be able to look after everyone, but through
your NHS is like really fucking stretched right now. I mean, this is
defunded. It's been defunded massively since the
it's
neoliberal turn.
Well, it's been funded more since World War II, right? Like healthcare costs have only gone up in the long term. You can look at short-term sections of defunding, but if you look at it, in terms of net costs compared to population, it's gone up consistently, right? There are times it dips, but healthcare spending, welfare spending has increased.
Okay, but the value of that money is less, isn't it? Money
No, I'm saying
in
adjusted for
1948.
inflation and population. If you adjust for inflation and population, you will see a consistent trend in neoliberal democracies or democratic constitutional republics, whatever fucking term you want to use for, neoliberal Western first world nations. You will see a consistent increase in welfare. I mean, so when we look at the United States, we have some of the lowest welfare of the industrialized Western democracies, and even still, if you don't account for interest on the debt, which is 13% of our payments, it is, let me see, I have the exact figure if I can get it. Welfare accounts for, let me just, where are you? Where are you? I want to give you the exact figure, right? I want to give you a guesstimation. It accounts for 61% of every federal tax dollar, right? So 61%. And then if you add in, the debt that's causing, it jumps up to 74%. So when we're talking about the U.S. debt, we're talking about welfare. We're not talking about the military defense spending, even though we have spend more than you guys times 200, right? We're not talking about infrastructure bills, public education, roads, bridges, any of that shit. We are talking about Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, TANF, food stamps, and corporate welfare, to be fair, right? Which is something I think we both would probably agree to get rid of. But again, so the ability to go in and say, oh, well, certain programs have been defunded and that's why they're doing poorly is just the data just doesn't match that in any way. Yes, if you
true,
reduce, no, it absolutely is true. You can look in the short term and you can have a short term defunding or or a specific program can be not have increased funding adjusted for inflation or adjusted for population. But in terms of how much of our, of the money that we make, GDP, as well as in real dollars per population, over time, welfare spending in Western liberal democracies has just gone up. And it is only, it's not making, we haven't won the war on poverty, right? Poverty still exists, destitution still exists, hard circumstances still exist.
So destitution and poverty, and again, it's to draw into another topic about capitalist critique, right? Critique of the system at play that cultivates the inequalities which we describe and then need welfare systems to come and sort out. But in terms of spending,
in a minute.
In terms of spending, though, absolutely in the UK, funding for healthcare, education, higher education, transportation, etc., have been cut and programs have been slashed, and the resources that were available to our predecessors are no longer available now, be it in malnourished, underfunded form, where it's less fruitful, less plentiful resources, or just cut entirely, handed over to the private sector. And that is the reason for a lot of the welfare state's inability to function properly. It's not that the system itself is inherently flawed, it's that it's not been given resources to cope with the increasing population, the modern demands of society. At the same time as that, you have a private sector which is bursting with wealth, which is absolutely flush with money and resources, and therefore, if you have resources to be able to access private healthcare, private transportation and such, private posting and such. In my country, Royal Mail has been privatised. Then great, you've got a lot of resources at your disposal. On the other hand, the average person who is below that wealth bracket isn't going to get some tough choices. They're going to potentially lose out, and so that is why
I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to understand. I want to have an honest conversation, and I'm not trying to accuse you of being dishonest. I just think that your data is wrong. So I'm trying to figure out where you are getting this idea that, so when we look up specifically just NHS, right? I wanted to focus on NHS, not because I'm trying to be sneaky. Maybe other programs have been cut, et cetera. And if you have data to support that, that's fine, right? But if I look up Institute for Fiscal Studies, .org.uk, ifs.org.uk, right, we can see that NHS has gone in real terms, this is below long-term historical average of approximately 3.6% per year. So in real terms, it has gone up 2.3% per year, adjusted for inflation. So more and more money, even adjusted for inflation, has been thrown at the NHS over the last decade. Now, that is less of an increase than the increasing decades before that. So if that's a cut, what you're saying is we cut how much money we were increasing over inflation. I don't get this concept of like, oh, we're actually making cuts because the rate of increase above inflation has lessened. Is there a different program you're talking about or something?
Sorry, so part of the problem with neoliberalism is that packaged into it is managerialism, is the introduction of middle management, is the tiering and hierarchization.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely right? I don't know it's neoliberalism.
If I just finish this little bit quickly, when you have the introduction of, as you say, like weighted spending, money that has been put into creating managers and creating bosses and creating jobs that don't need to exist within the organization, that is where the money has gone, right? You see hospitals with fairly wealthy, I'll say bureaucrats, but like administrators and people who have given themselves a very large salary at the expense of the actual healthcare program. So
right, but this is a goalpost shift, right? This is a goalpost shift.
No, it's not a goalpost shift. No,
it absolutely is. Now, if you're saying that less, yeah, it absolutely is. Your new argument, I would presume, is that less money is going towards the actual individuals that need it because there is administrative bloat of the managerial class. I agree with you. As an anarcho-capitalist, I'm against welfare, and one of the reasons I'm against welfare is because of the bloat and inefficiency of government programs, right? So you're making my argument for me, and you're not actually presenting evidence of your previous claim. Hold on. Your previous claim, which was that these programs are not succeeding because funding has been cut. And I'm saying I've not heard that. That is not something that the data seems, and when we look at something like the NHS, what we see is not funding cuts, but funding increases, just less increases than there used to be, but still real increases by both GDP and population and adjusted for inflation, just not to the degree that it was before. Now you're saying, well, there's administrative bloat, the money's not getting down to the people. I agree, government is inefficient, and this is one of the reasons why I'm against welfare. I appreciate you making the argument for me, but can you deal with the original argument?
Right, okay. I didn't make your argument for you. The issue wasn't the welfare system. The issue wasn't the welfare system, right? The cuts have been there. You're talking about people who have attached themselves to various elements of government, via private sector. Let's not forget the private sector does take control of many
right? Like NGOs and things like that too, right? Like it's a little bit of
it's not pseudo-private. It is capitalist organizations with the express interest of making a profit on various services that come in and do the job of various what was once state sector stuff, and that leads to resources pooling upwards, it's going upwards, and then not the previous level of operation that was seen prior to.
So that's not private. So hold on.
But going back to what we said a second ago.
Hold on. Hold on. I have to call this out because this is a bit of a fallacious argument, right? Which is you're sneaking in.
Can we go back to what we were saying about the?
I'll be very quick, right? You're sneaking in a proposition with the term private, right? And so you're using the term private to mean that it is a company that wishes to make a profit, but you are describing a process which is a monopsony, which is where the state is the purchaser of the product on behalf of welfare and things of that nature. So it is anything but capitalistic when a private firm or corporation takes on government contracts to deal with like housing or welfare or building projects or any of those things, because it's only one buyer, which is the UK or the American taxpayer, and it is out of a capitalist market. So I just want to point out that private doesn't mean capitalism, right? It's a mixed market economy, kind of like bait and switch thing we're doing here.
It's not quite a bait and switch though. A mixed market, where you have private entities, as you say, taking a contract from the state, has still used the same tenets to, use their capital, use their wealth to secure a contract, and then put themselves in a profit-making position. That's still
agreed.
capitalism.
Well, no, that's not
still
capitalism.
the same.
That's capitalism by some definitions, right? But when I am talking about capitalism, I am talking about a free market capitalism. I'm not talking about a mixed market economy where corporations don't provide goods and services to voluntary customers, but instead utilize state power and regulations to be able to obtain contracts that are involuntary, right? It goes very against the ethos of what capitalism is.
But do we understand why those entities and organizations operate in that manner, right? Like they're acting in their capitalist interest. They want to make more money, and so they go to the state and put themselves in an advantageous position to be able to advantageous position to secure the contract that rewards them quite a bit of financial reward.
Yeah, it's a mixed market thing. It's part socialist and part capitalistic, but it's not capitalist.
It's not socialist.
But how is it not socialist if it is a government involuntary program that is directed by the state, and then they choose private firms and give them contracts? This is no longer a voluntary exchange. This is no longer capitalism.
Well, it's not a democratic work thing, is it? It's not like it's been the state acting as agent isn't the same thing as a socialist state, is it? Or a socialist society?
Well, no, it's
a
mixed market economy. It's in part capitalistic and in part socialist, and that is what I'm pointing out, is that when we use terms like private and then we say like the capitalist, right? It's important to point out that this goes against the very ethos of capitalism, or my position, which is free market capitalism, voluntary exchanges. Like, I'm not trying to be a dick, Ray. I'm just trying to point out that these are different things we're talking about.
Yes, there's a difference there, but I'm saying the distinction isn't like the most meaningful, essentially, because it's still, at the end of the day,
it is if I'm advocating for something else and then people are attaching bad things that I disagree with the thing I'm advocating for.
Okay,
right?
That's fair enough then. We'll
you know
talk
what I mean?
I'll happily disagree on that point. What I'm saying, sorry. I can't think how to express it. I get what you're saying, that you are not advocating for what I am describing.
Mm-hmm.
We'll come on to it a bit later, that's fine. On the topic of the what were we saying about welfare a second ago? Yeah, okay, so cuts to services. There 100% have been job losses, like positions at various state controlled entities, NHS, schools, various public sector stuff, in which cuts have been made to jobs that interact with the everydays of society.
Because government's inefficient.
But that's not the government.
That's a failure of
a right wing. Yeah, a failure of a right-wing program that the government have followed. It's not the failure of welfare as a concept, like the welfare state.
Well, no, it's not a failure of welfare as a concept. It's a failure of government-run welfare and the administrative bloat that you previously described, right? Which is kind of my argument, is that when you don't have a market incentive for a profit loss mechanism, where you're selling goods or services at either the lowest price or at an increased quality so that people choose to voluntarily engage in those services, but instead you're stealing money from people to fund government-run programs, that those same incentives don't exist, and that they lead towards a growth in administrative bloat, an increase in a growth of cost. And so the cost of these things keeps going up, and they keep getting funded more and more, and despite the increased funding, there's still job cuts, and that's because of the inefficiency of the state. Now, you can say the reason those inefficiencies of the state and the way those programs are managed is something that you'd like to fix and that a more efficient way of doing it, but it doesn't discount the reality, right? Which is that those programs over time have not been cut. What has occurred is that they have bloated, they have gotten more expensive, and because of that, the increases have not kept up with the demands.
Okay, so the market forces being introduced to those sectors is why the issues exist, right? They previously were they were previously there as a fundamental. We need to do this as a social good. We need to have it as something that exists for people to use the service because it is a humanitarian good thing to have. Obviously, they still took place in capitalistic society, right? It still takes place. I'm not saying it was like, the communist world, and then suddenly the 80s hit and neoliberalism happens. Of course, it was still a capitalist state doing this. But
Mm-hmm.
the neoliberal term describes the introduction of the market into much of the public sector. And with that introduction comes the cuts to services, which did happen. Like, for as much as obviously, more is spent now, but that isn't a contradiction of cuts happening for hospitals, schools, arts, etc.
Well, no, it is, because your original argument was that the reason these programs are doing poorly is because of right-wing people and government officials producing cuts in these places. And then we eventually get to the portion that it's not the cuts that are the major problem. Now, the cuts you might deem a problem, but overall that funding has increased, but that these programs have gotten less efficient. And by your argument now, the inefficiency has been added by adding market mechanisms to the situation.
Inefficiency is part of it, but cuts is also a major part of it.
The funding has gone up. Can we just admit that funding has gone up, right? Because that is the reality.
I mean, like, in terms of like a number, like, sure,
adjusted
like
for inflation, cut that we have not had cuts. We have had increases in both the UK and in the United States. In terms of real numbers adjusted for inflation.
I would need to read that a little closer. You've got the statistic in front of me, because sure,
it's like I said, if you have a countervailing statistic, I'm willing to take that in, right? Like, I gave you ifs.org.uk. If you have a different statistic or a different article that proves this wrong, or is against this, I'm fine. But in the lack of you having any data to support that claim, and me having at least some data to support the claim that these things have gone forward, that like government, you know what I mean? Like I think it's a silly hill to die on to say that the cuts are the problem. And then I say, well, the cuts didn't happen. Only some cuts have happened in a short term. You can see individual cuts. Like every time, there's an omnibus bill in America, for example, there's increases in spending and then there's cuts in spending. But over the long term, over the last decade and over the last 50 years, we've seen an increase in funding for welfare in both of our countries. And so it's not the lack of funding that is the problem. It is these other problems that you're describing, right? Which is neoliberals bringing in pseudo private institutions that are just trying to gobble state money, not actually in a free market. And because of inefficiencies and bloat of government run health welfare, which again is my
increase in funding disproportionate to the other increases in the costs of operating and functioning in society, which is still in effect a cut, because the spending power of your money is less potent than it previously was. So the school, for instance, gets a budget that is bigger.
Hold on, we're talking about adjusted for inflation numbers.
The school, I was just let me finish quickly. The school has got a bigger budget on paper, sure, but they're expected to buy their pens, pencils, whiteboards, fund a higher electricity bill, do more with less. So that only makes sense if the numbers aren't adjusted for inflation. The numbers are adjusted for inflation.
Now, if you want to argue that things like rent and housing have gotten so astronomically high that discretionary spending that regular Americans have, especially in the lower quintile of the economic sector, are they have less purchasing power despite in greater excess than the inflation rate is speaking of, because we're talking about a specific demographic, and you want to bring up Gini coefficient and things like that, that's fine, right? Like we can have that conversation, and we can have a conversation about where those things come from. But when you're talking about healthcare costs and things of that nature, the heart surgery is not really something that is in people's discretionary spending anyways. So I think it's kind of, for certain things, it's going to be a moot point. For other things, I don't necessarily disagree with you that the spending power of those that are poor is much less than it was, even adjusted for inflation, right? Than it was maybe in the 1980s, for example, right? When we look at rent and we look at, the cost of housing and the increase in wages, we can see that it's ever more expensive to buy a home or to rent property
Yeah.
than it used to be. Like I can meet you halfway there, right? Because I'm genuinely trying to be honest with this conversation. I can meet you halfway there and say that those
Likewise.
at the bottom have less spending power that isn't necessarily appropriately calculated when we look at, inflation. And maybe then you have some argument about funding, but I still don't quite see. I don't think it bridges that gap, and it certainly is not worthy of a univariate analysis, which I think we both agree, right? Because we started talking about administrative bloat and about corporations, kind of like the Margaret Thatcher kind of like aspect of bringing in private markets into this government thing, which to me is anathema to capitalism, right? This is anathema to a free market economy. And I think it does worsen and cheapen healthcare services and other things when you have this pseudo amalgam. Like I would almost rather have socialism than to have like this, like, we're going to do socialism, but we're going to bring in private corporations and get them rich too. And it's like, okay, you're just making it worse.
Yeah. Okay. So I think then it's not so much that we're sort of I can see what you're saying there, in the sense that there's an element of like terminal. Sorry, I'm losing track of thought here a little bit. What were we saying? Sorry. Sorry, you say what you just said. My mind went blank very quickly.
Right, but what I'm saying is like I'm willing. I reject the concept that funding has gone down and that funding is a primary in the analysis is a primary concern in terms of why welfare is unsuccessful. That my determination and the evidence that I see is that it is that administrative bloat you're talking about, and it is the introduction of corporations, non-governmental organizations, which are essentially governmental organizations, except for their rich fat cat friends, that these have certainly made those costs go up. I would add another domain that you haven't added, right? And mine would be that we have done a poor job of tracking the real effects of welfare spending, because some of these effects are multi-generational. They're not seen immediately in the data, right? I would argue that there are cultural costs, that there are social costs, and that breaking down communities breaks down spontaneous order and values. And that's a more sociological approach to this. But I would argue that is another fundamental issue here when we're talking about the lack of success of welfare programs.
Okay, then we'll put a pin in that then. I'll come back to what you said just then. You don't see the lack of the funding issue. Let's imagine you're a hospital, you're in a big city centre, you've got thousands of people coming through every day, right? So obviously, you need emergency response team, you need people on the hospital floor, you need various doctors available,
you need
nurses,
medicine,
paramedics.
You got to pay rent.
Exactly.
There's a billion things.
Electricity, everything. The hospital, compared to what it had, does not have the same spending power. It does not have the same budget and resources and staff to actually manage itself in a way that can support all people that previously used it. So the people using this hospital wait for longer. They might not see their doctor that day. They might not have the ambulance actually show up because the ambulance is busy dealing with 10 other calls, and so it's stuck in a backlog. When they get to their surgery, they're told, unfortunately, it's been postponed. Doctor couldn't make it today. Go on a waiting list.
Yeah, I mean, the waiting lists in the UK are insane compared to the US.
Exactly.
It's
and
nightmarish.
that has exactly right, and that has stemmed directly from the cuts to spending to the services that exist.
See, this is where we disagree. The spending hasn't been cut. What has occurred is that there is less.
Cuts to spending on direct services.
Okay, that is a different argument, right? On direct services. If we were talking about an increase in funding for NHS, which is what we have had in inflation adjusted, real money terms, we have an average of 2.6% increase year after year in the last decade in the UK, which is lower than the historical average of a 3.6% increase, right? If you were talking about funding for direct services, right, which would be like money for the doctor, money for saline, money for the, for the hospital to pay its bills, as opposed to administrative bloat within the government or other companies that are, supposed to kind of take over that role because the NHS is stressed. So another company comes in and takes a government contract and then is overpaid for that contract. I don't disagree with you, but again, once you make that argument, you're kind of on my side, right? Which is the government has been proven to be inefficient at rendering these services and is bloated over time.
The government, as managed by right-wing people who believe in the free market, yes, that is the absolute.
None of those people believe in the right market. If they believe in the free market, they would absolutely get rid of the NHS and only have a private healthcare system.
Believe in their interpretation of a free market. Sure, they don't believe exactly the same principles.
They don't believe in a free market. There's no reason to say their interpretation of a free market. Like, you're trying to sneak in free market capitalism, like free market capitalism is what's to blame here. It's not. It's not free market capitalism. They don't support free market capitalism. They're not for free market capitalism. They're not engaging in that. Like, what they're engaging in is socialist regulations, socialist funding, and monopsonies, and then they bring in, as much like mixed market economies do, private entities or organizations that are for-profit entities and organizations, and then they funnel involuntary taxpayer money to these companies that are bidding in a pseudo-competitive market. Because let's be honest, in every country, it's like 2 or 3 fucking companies that are just kind of like playing whack-a-mole with whose turn it is to get the contract, as opposed to a true, competitive market.
Okay, so then the issue seems to be that I have identified the element that I don't like, and I've called it capitalist. You've identified the thing you didn't like, you've called it socialist. So clearly there's some terminological
but we're also identifying the same thing, at least in this domain.
Yeah, right? We both dislike the current management of our societies, our countries, various sectors, right? What we can identify, though, is, as you said a second ago, someone has come in and said, we want to profit from this function more. We want to make money from what is taking place further than what was seen previously. And so that is why we can identify this as a right-wing element of this operation, right? They've come in, they've said, we can manage this better than what was seen previously. Sorry?
How is that right-wing? What does that have to do with right-wing? Feels like you're just adding a label.
It comes specifically from introducing free market sectors, introducing corporate spending.
We've already agreed this isn't free market capitalism.
We haven't agreed that. I just said we both got different labels for it, but ultimately.
Okay, so you think it's free market capitalism to have a monopsony and an involuntary exchange?
Monopsony.
Yeah, monopsony is when you have one buyer of a product, right? So a monopoly would be like one seller of a product, right? A monopsony is an opposite. So the government says if we're bidding contracts, we're the only one that's doing this, right? No one else is doing this. So like, let's say we were building, submarines, right? They don't allow the private market to build their own submarines for their own private navy, right? So the government would be engaged in a monopsony in saying, okay, we'll go to Lockheed Martin, we'll go to these 4 companies. So there are multiple buyers of the product, right? But there's only there's multiple sellers of the product, right? They're all competing to sell submarines to the UK government or the US government. There's only one buyer because there's not allowed to be another buyer. That's what a monopsony is.
Yeah, and you can see that's obviously going to be it's like there's no.
Yeah, it's not capitalism.
But it is.
No, it's not. It's not capitalism.
Okay. It's not like complete deregulation, no state whatsoever. But as we spoke about history earlier, you can see why that isn't the case, right? You can see why society has organized itself into this fashion. I feel like I was going to say something very quickly about the privatization we're seeing here. The government has put their previously state-owned assets on the market and said to various entities and organizations, if you pay us, we'll give you this for you to operate. That is a capitalist. That is a market.
Sorry, hold on. Yes, monopsony. Sorry, I pronounced it with an M. You fucking autistic nerds. I love you guys. My chat is like giving me shit for saying monopsony and monopsony instead of monopsony.
Everyone mispronounces stuff sometimes.
Go ahead. Sorry.
That's right. So yeah, um, if the government puts its assets on the market and lets lets corporations, lets big entities try and compete, obviously only certain entities going to have a chance because it costs a lot of money and you need to have existing assets and resources to be able to say yes, we're going to take on a
You got to buy
healthcare
off the
contract.
right you got to buy off the right politicians. You got
Exactly
to
right. That's part of it
all
as
of these
well.
things that are anti-capitalist.
But can you see the fund? Like, yes, of course. No, you're not. Of course, I'm not going to say like, oh yes, you support corruption in government and stuff. Of course not. But because when I think it comes back to that historical elements of it, that power structure that is at play, because ultimately this decision is an expression of power. It's a decision that has been made to consolidate wealth and power in um, the structure of people at the top of society, right?
Agreed.
Corporate power, corporate structure. They've
The
they've set up
cathedral.
this market deal. Yeah, exactly. They've set the deal up to ensure that only people of the right parties can do it. Someone could probably come in and say, well, we've got a more efficient way of operating this healthcare system. We're not going to cut dozens of frontline workers. We're going to actually say, well, why are you paying yourself millions?
You could do that in a free market, but you can't do that under government-run welfare.
You can,
because you don't have the political capital, you don't have the assets, the things like that to be able to play at the big kids table where the government is doling out those contracts. But in a free market, you could run a small hospital. If you have like a new efficient way of running things, then you'd be able to lower prices in a competitive market. But you can't do that with state-run.
Okay, but accompanying the turn to the private sector is mass tax cuts. Previously, part of the to go back to sort of the start of what we were saying, part of the big growth of human development and such was also the highest, really high tax rates. People used to there used to be high tax rates for the wealthiest, corporations, etc. Then neoliberalism happens, then the 80s happen, Reagan, Thatcher, etc. Tax cuts all across the board. We'll leave it to you. Corporations basically given more incentive to do as they see fit with less regulation, and then you see the degrading effect on the welfare system. The loss of capability for hospitals, schools, transport, sports, all that stuff.
Sorry.
And that is why, as you say, if you just gave it all back to the government right now and didn't do anything else, it would struggle because it's not got the same spending power it used to. Hence the reliance on the private sector, and hence the dominance of blatantly corrupt corporations, basically taking contracts and mismanaging various sectors. And I think there's like I said at the start, I'm a pragmatist. Like I'm not suggesting we click our fingers and instantly everything is handed back to the government straight away.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there needs to be recognition of the fact that when we allow people with the interest of their own profits to operate various sectors of society, there is going to be a fundamental problem because their interest is what is our revenue for this month, not how can we deliver the best service to John with a broken leg or Susan who's
right. But again, so there's two things here. One, we're getting into this causation correlation fallacy here a little bit.
In what way?
Where you're saying historically tax rates were higher and these things were better, and then we bring in these tax cuts. So there's two problems with that. Number one, that's just not really true. There's a difference between statutory tax rate and effective tax rate. So when you actually look at effective tax rate, they've been fairly consistent over the past 60 years. Effective tax, so you had a higher statutory tax rate, especially in the U.S., like somewhere upwards. I think the highest it peaked at was like 54%, right? But the effective tax rate was lower then in the 1950s than it is today. So there was actually paying less taxes then than they're paying today. What we've actually seen is tax increases. Now this is before Now, obviously, if we want to go back far enough before income taxes, obviously income taxes were added and then they phased in. And so we got, we did get a new revenue source, but that also correlated with a reduction in tariffs, right? Because, at the turn of the century, there was a lot of tariffs and there were a lot of other taxes. There were other means of getting income. So no, the effective tax rate has been relatively unchanged. It's gone down a little bit from where it peaked in I want to say the late 50s to as you say, the introduction of neoliberalism in the 1980s. But also the problem is tax revenue versus tax rates, right? So have you heard of the Laffer curve?
What, sorry?
In economics, do you know what the Laffer curve is?
Yes, yeah.
Or Laffer curve?
Oh, I haven't. What, sorry? No, I misheard you. So what?
Laffer curve. I think it's Laffer curve technically. So just because you have a higher tax rate does not mean you pull in more tax revenue. Sometimes you get more tax revenue by lowering taxes. So the government gets more money because more economic transactions occur. So for example, just in silly, stupid bird's eye view, to simplify the concept, let's say I am a customer and you are a seller of a product. You sell widgets, okay? And your widgets cost 40 cents a piece. And I have $1, okay? And now the sales tax is 20%. So I go to you and I say, 45 cents. So you sell them for 45 cents and the sales tax is 20%. So I go to you and you say, I love your widgets. I'd like to buy 2 of your widgets. That's 90 cents. And they go, okay, well, that's another 18 cents. That's $1.08. And I go, ooh, I can only buy 1 widget. So I buy 1 widget for 45 cents. Let's say you make 5 cents in profit off of a widget. And then I get the widget. And then the government gets 0.9 cents, right? So they get 9 cents in revenue because it was a 20% tax. Now let's say the government cuts the tax in half. They slash the taxes from 20% all the way down to 10%. Same scenario. You sell widgets for 5 cents in profit a piece for 45 cents, and then I have $1. I go to you and I say, let me get 2 widgets, and you say, with taxes, that'll be exactly $1. Okay? So now you made 10 cents in profit. You made more profit. I get 2 widgets, which is what I wanted, as opposed to just having 49 cents left over and I don't know what to do with it. And the government gets 10 cents, right? Sorry, 0.9. So the government gets the exact same amount of revenue. So we can cut the tax rate by 50%. We can halve the tax rate, and the government still gets the exact same amount of tax revenue, and you get more profit because there was less taxes, so there was more economic transactions. And on top of that, there's, the supply and demand equation has moved, so maybe you even have the prices go down so you can sell even more, so you can get a higher rate of profit, and I get more widgets, the things that I wanted to buy. So when we're talking about taxes and we're just talking about statutory tax rate in the 1920s or the 1950s and being neoliberalism came in and cut the taxes so we have less tax revenue, that's not exactly how it works, because you have to look at the effective tax rate, not the statutory tax rate. So you got to account for, subsidies and tax write-offs and all these other things that were occurring. And you have to look at actual tax revenue that comes in, because sometimes, very often, if it's overtaxed, you will get more revenue. The government will get more money by lowering taxes. This happened under the Trump administration, for example. When he did the corporate tax rate and the individual tax cuts, we actually saw an increase in revenue from Donald Trump cutting taxes. So the government took in more money in taxation. It stole more money because it lowered taxes.
I mean, ultimately, a lot of what you say there, whilst having basis in history of the country and such, doesn't change the fact that ultimately, in the 80s, the intervention that we saw, two things happened, right? State was given, state sector was cut, privatized, assets sold off and such, and tax for corporations, via through loopholes, via breaks, all the things you describe. Then they had an easier time creating their fortunes, generating their wealth. And whilst you are right, there are ways in which various tax mechanisms can be constructed in that sense. At the same time, the ability of the corporate structures and financial organizations to generate their wealth was made much easier by that 80s turn. And that's what we're saying when we talk about the decrease in tax, the decrease in the ability for the government to control various elements of society decreased. And so the
yeah, but again, this is my argument.
Welfare. Sorry?
But this is my argument, right? Like, okay, you're not going to get rid of welfare tomorrow. I totally understand. You're not seeing the inherent problems that I see with welfare and the community destruction aspect, or the philosophical reasoning why I think taxation is theft and why, this is actually, increasing poor behavior and incentivizing bad things. We're not going to agree on those things. We're just too diametrically opposed in our philosophical views. But if you agree with me that government handouts and government, kickbacks and government coming in and privatizing by bringing in corporations into monopsony markets and all of these things are bad, which is what I also agree with, then that's a thing that we can talk about. That's a thing that we can work towards a common goal and making things better for all of us. But ultimately, that is part of my argument, is that the government has mishandled welfare to such a degree that it is a collapsing system. Now, you say it is predominantly that the introduction of this type of mixed market economy, neoliberal bullshit that you dislike. I would say that it is a combination of factors, and that's one of the problems. But why would we not work hand in hand towards eliminating that bullshit? Let's work hand in hand on making sure that Kristi Noem, who got kicked out of Congress because of sex scandals, is in California right now, and she's the CEO of a company that's supposed to provide housing to the poor, and also sits on a board in California to determine which companies get state funding, and then they don't actually build any houses for the poor. They house 50 people, and then they just siphon millions of dollars. I think it was $5 million in wealth away from Californians that are paying taxes. We don't agree on those fundamental things, but the things that we do agree on, you can call it capitalism and I can call it mixed market economy socialism, but we both hate it, and I both would say that we should focus on it. But again, these are areas of agreement, not disagreement. And so I don't know at that point where this conversation goes in terms of you disagreeing with my takes, if we continue down this domain of this area that we both hate and we both want to get rid of. And I welcome your support of my argument.
Okay, but then you're so I agree with what you said in the sense of, yes, it's bad that someone who is clearly unfit to do the job that they've been given is put into that position, being able to leave government, go into the corporate world, suddenly be in control of giant private contract, and basically running it for.
What's how the rich do shit? But, they have kids, and then their kids become philanthropists. And it's when I hear the term philanthropist, I hear a silver spoon fed rich kid that is almost certainly using my tax dollars to enrich themselves, and then pat themselves on the back for fixing problems that they maintained.
Exactly, but that to me isn't all of this is stuff that has attached itself to the core principle of what the welfare system was. And I think the overall point as well, because I think part of the issue is that the reason we had to have a welfare state to begin with was because of the existing inequalities that our power structure that we inherited from the feudal era and from centuries of unjust systems and inequalities left us with. And I think
remember what I said in the beginning, name the trait? You just keep saying the existing system's power. I hear a lot of buzzwords, but I'm not hearing any details on what you're saying is because your argument is welfare was necessary because of these things, but then you haven't actually named any of these things. You've just said systems, inequality. You've given me buzzwords.
If we have, okay then, sure. I wouldn't call it buzzwords, but sure, I'll be a bit more specific.
Mhm.
If we have a right-wing system where we are expected to
Right
sell
wing
our
is another
labor
thing that you
on
can't
the
define.
capitalistic profit, selling labor to gain access to the things in society we need to live. So
Okay, so
place of
if you
shelter, water,
so hold on.
food.
If you believe in private property, you are right wing.
Rewind slightly. Private through that definition, in the sense of private for like profit making. Sorry, we'll come back to that in a second. What we have society.
All those things
Society
stem from
currently is
private property,
operated.
right? Like I have exclusive control over my property. So you're saying everyone that
What
believes in
property are you
private
talking about,
property,
How are
all
we
property
defining
that I
private
gain,
property?
there is no distinction.
What I have. Okay,
What do you
so
mean?
personal versus private property. So
That would be
like
material things, scarce resources. Okay, I'll define private property for you. So scarce resources that
Hold on a
I have
second. Wait,
exclusive
hold on a
control
minute.
over.
Right.
That's it.
Sorry, what were we saying a second ago? Sorry, right?
Well, I'm trying to. You're saying, oh, well, these right wing things, and I'm like, well, what the fuck do you mean by right wing, right? Because right wing is a kind of more of like a vibe for most people. They don't have a good definition of what makes something right wing or left wing, and it seems to be that you're describing a majority view of Western society is just right wing, which is the existence that like I have my property and I'm allowed to do with my property as I please, so long as I'm not like aggressing upon another person, which would be like 90% of Westerners.
But that isn't quite that sense that you said. I have my stuff and I can do what I see fit. That's fine. The issue or the element of right wing theory and politics and such, where it comes into it is through what is done beyond your remit. So your hoodie, for instance, was made elsewhere from where you are now, right? Like it has several interventions several stages of labor have gone into turning it from raw materials into the hoodie you're wearing now. Because the processes through which that hoodie was produced were managed for a profit by entities which control vastly more than what they personally interact with. That can be described as you would agree, like a market system, a capitalistic. Take this and sell it for more.
Free market capitalism, but it's capitalistic, right? It's a market economy for profit.
Yeah, market economy for profit. And so when people enter the world, they are expected to engage with these principles, right? They go to their places of employment, they do their job, they get a wage back, and then they can use that wage to buy things that are on the same market they are contributing their services to. And so because so the organization of society through these principles, allowing people to engage with it as they see fit, they've got a freedom to engage with it how they see fit. That is right wing. That is what I am describing when I say right wing. Market.
That's if that's your definition of right wing, like I won't begrudge you saying that, like that's your definition. That like I think it's a terrible definition because it's because it describes your definition of right wing is anything that isn't communist, that isn't Marxist in its philosophy is right wing. So that like sure, that can be your definition of right wing. It would certainly be to the right of you, but calling that right wing kind of loses any functional definition because the term right wing that most people are engaged in is going to be to the right of center, right? And so there's a kind of a framing device here
I agree.
where like Marxism is the center. And then
I've never said Marxism was the center.
I'm not saying that you're saying Marxism is the center, but when you say that anything that isn't Marxism in its philosophy and how it engages in the distribution of resources, right? Because that's what economics is, right? Is how do we distribute scarce resources because scarcity exists, right? And so capitalism is one solution. communism is one, democratic. So like different economic models are offering different solutions to the problem, which is we have a scarcity of resources. And so if you're saying everything that isn't Marxist in its philosophy is right wing, then by definition, you're kind of, by using right wing where people assume that means to the right of center, you're kind of sneaking in this proposition that everything that isn't Marxism is right wing, and that's why I'm like, define right wing. This is why I think I just objectively showed exactly how you're doing that.
No, I don't think you did objectively show that, but we can go back to what you said in there.
Are you,
of course,
why do you just deny what I say? Just deal with the argument.
No, because you didn't you didn't objectively prove it. It was just your opinion. But
no, it's not my opinion. I gave reasoning. Is the reasoning wrong?
The term right wing, of course, has context, like like it's got colloquial meaning, right? Like, of course, it comes from. If I said today, Bernie Sanders is right wing, of course, it would be, you'd raise an eyebrow, right? But when I say right wing, I'm talking in this conversation.
Well, Bernie Sanders would be right wing
of the capitalist
to you.
Sorry? Oh, like, you're not listening to what I'm saying. Obviously,
I'm listening very clearly.
In terms of what is colloquial to our society now, we have left and right. But because we live in a world that is dominated and based on markets and based on things that are derived from capitalism, the vision that like someone like Adam Smith, for instance, would talk about in 17 whenever, it's built from those principles. And yes, of course, there have been interventions. Of course, there is meddling. Of course, it's not a 100% free market, of course. But the principles are still based on that. Take X, sell it for more than what you bought it for. You are a capitalist. You have made more money. You can expand your capital and accumulate more. That is what we're talking about when we say right wing. And so for this conversation, yes, the majority of the world does operate on varying degrees of right wing logic and rhetoric. Like, can you see that?
No, I'm not saying that your usage is wrong per se. What I'm saying is that I believe that there is a need for a recognition that when you say right wing, you mean 95% of people living in liberal democracies, right? Like, and that's
systems, and so, not people, systems.
Okay, sure, but if people support the philosophical presuppositions for those systems, then they are philosophically founded in right-wing ideology.
Sculpted by it, sure.
I mean, like, you're basically saying I mean, like, you're like, and that's like, if that's the definition that you want to use because you're a Marxist, like, I understand that. I formally was a Marxist, right? When I was young, I was a Marxist-Leninist Maoist. I was like hardcore in it, right? Over time, I aged and became more libertarian, and and theory brought me all the way to anarcho-capitalism. But again, I'm not saying you can't use that to say right wing. I'm just saying, for the audience's sake, when he says right wing, what he means is everyone that believes in private property as a means of having exclusive control over their property, and that if you don't believe in what's that?
So private property. I think the word private is another thing to contest meaning of, right? Because it's got two meanings. Your bathroom is private, and no one would dispute that, right? Like, it's a bit of an interesting example, but when I think of the word private, there's the first meaning, which is that every person has their own space and their own right to privacy. Like, whatever happens in my bathroom, bedroom is my own business. And then there's private, how we use it in political terms, where a corporation can buy, say, entire sweep of land and say, this is our private property, we've got a fence around it, if you come in here, you'll be shot. You'll be, detained and sanctioned by the law.
I think to the libertarians here, we've kind of heard these arguments a billion times, right? Like, what you're describing is the distinction between personal and private property, right?
Yeah, sure.
And to anyone, asking, like just read Kropotkin's Conquest of Bread, right? Like, I mean, when the Marxists goes face off, you recognize that there is no distinction between personal and private property. That this is a meaningless distinction that is a rhetorical tool to bring about Marxism. There isn't a real meaningful distinction between personal and private because you're not capable of delineating that, because you don't have any foundation for the objective foundation for what becomes or what is personal property versus private property. That all property is private property, right? And this is why I would suggest people read Kropotkin. Like, it's a meaningless distinction when you're not even using the personal versus private. You're kind of, I don't know if you're running away from it, or you just haven't heard that distinction, or that's not how your argumentation is. I don't want to say that you're being extra sneaky or anything, because I don't fucking know. But what you're essentially talking about is a distinction between personal and private property. But there is no, how would you philosophically ground and objectively say X is personal property versus Y being private property? Do you have any answer to that quandary? I guess this is how it should be. Maybe I shouldn't put words in your mouth. Do you have that distinction?
You're not trying to put words in my mouth. I think personal, because you're right, it is tricky, and it's blurry, I think, a little bit as well. Personal is what we use in our day-to-day life, what is stuff that has connection to us in our routines and our schedules, stuff that we wouldn't take as some
I love when
business
British people
venture.
say schedule. I love the British way of saying schedule.
Schedule. It's interesting, actually. There's loads of words which have been Americanized and sort of crept into the British English. It's a funny thing, language.
Sorry, but so how are you making this distinction between personal and private property? How do you make that distinction? How do you delineate the two?
What do you use to make profit from, in terms of market terms? That is essentially, if you have gone and bought a piece of land with the express purpose of making profit from it, then that has that can be seen as
my toothbrush.
Profit.
My toothbrush. My toothbrush is no longer personal property.
Your toothbrush. You profit from your toothbrush.
Because I'm a streamer, right, and I make profit via streaming in some regard, right, via donations, via ad revenue and things like that, right? The more fucked up my teeth look, the less views I get. So I distinctly go out and buy a toothbrush and make sure that I floss and brush my teeth so that my teeth aren't too yellow. Everything is going to be utilized to gain some portion of
but that one's
profit.
not that you could. But that is, you brush your teeth anyway, though. That's not the fact that
you don't know that. Have you seen Asmongold? The dude lives with roaches. All right, there's no proof that not for the desire for profit, the desire to gain wages, the desire to build from the voluntary transactions of other people, that I wouldn't spend money on things that improve myself, my look, the way I speak, the way I act, so that I can gain more profit. There is no distinction between personal and private property.
You having one or two toothbrushes, no one's gonna care about, right? There's enough toothbrushes. If you bought 1,000 toothbrushes and then said, you're gonna have to pay me for some of these so maybe you've bought the shop that sells toothbrushes and then you've upmarked a price and tried to make a bit of money off it. That is where we would call that private property, and that's where we would have an issue. So
that's a meaningless distinction.
As it exists, but it's not meaningless, because in one example it's something you use and you need. In the other, you have now introduced market.
Right, but you haven't delineated. See, all you've done is gone to an extreme, right? Which is gone to two extremes, right? One toothbrush is one extreme, and then the store that sells toothbrushes is another extreme. And then the way that you've delineated it in your argument is that you bought the toothbrush store so that you could make a profit. But the problem is that I also bought the single toothbrush so that I can make a profit. There's no meaningful distinction here. You're just saying there is one by using a different extreme, and that sounds reasonable because our intuition is that these things are different. But the difference is not the mechanism by which you establish property. The difference is the excess. I don't have a toothbrush store, so it feels like that person is doing something that is exploitative in some degree because they have the toothbrush store. But you haven't actually delineated them in how you establish property. There's no foundation there.
Okay. The point at which you have tried to market and where you've tried to commodify the toothbrush and turned it into some business venture is the point that is criticized. The toothbrush as a device to clean one's teeth is not the issue. To use another example, we spoke about hoodies earlier. One person, having a set of clothes for yourself, not an issue. That's your stuff. That's your personal property. That's fine. Where the resources because I think that's the focus when we talk about this sort of stuff. It's not like one person in their house doing whatever. It's the conglomerate, the organization of capital at the behest of a limited number of people taking over vast swaths of land as we see today and using that as some business venture. And that is what is.
So how many hoodies is too many hoodies?
Used to say, right? But clearly,
that's a serious problem, right? If I have 1,000 hoodies, right? Wouldn't you say that this goes beyond my scope of personal property and goes into a certain domain? Am I allowed to hoard wealth? Am I allowed to hoard all the hoodies? Hoodies. I want all the hoodies.
I mean, past a certain point, you'd stop being able to have. You wouldn't have the
What's
space.
What's that point? Right.
Okay. I don't know the exact point at which there is, too much or too little of hoodies. However, the focus is very clearly on. But is it a problem though? Because
yes, absolutely.
Like, as I said,
you can't vibe out whether or not people are allowed to procure property for personal use.
We're not focusing on the some person who likes hoodies. We're focusing on
the reason I am is because
the cost whoever has millions of the stuff, right? Like I think that's the part of the issue for me. Like I want to think in terms of the vaster, the broader perspective here. Like and that's not to say of course that like if I got my way and we switched all of a sudden to a different economic model, of course there'd be hard moments and hard questions, and of course there'd be grey areas where we struggled to think, what is too much, what's too few. Mm-hmm. But these concerns are dwarfed by like some like Gap in who own sweatshops and such and have control of millions of
so here's the problem.
Being produced.
Here's the problem. Right?
Surely that's the issue.
So here's the problem. If we go all the way down to a fundamental level, libertarianism, right, is able to describe private property, and the Marxism that you're advocating for is incapable of doing so without. So when let's say Robinson and Crusoe both are stranded on an island, right? Robinson is stranded on the island, Crusoe is stranded on the island. And there is a stick, and the stick is nice and it's flexible. And Crusoe thinks, I should use this stick to catch fish because we're stuck on this island. This would be a great fishing pole or spear, we'll say. I'm going to whittle it down to the spear so that I can, frog gig and, maybe gig some fish so we can get food so we can eat. And Robinson says, well, no, that stick is needed so I can build a raft so that we can get the fuck off this island and get back to civilization. Now, who does the stick belong to? Who gets to use the stick?
Well, it doesn't belong to either. It's a stick. They should work together. They could probably both find a way of achieving either of it.
There's one stick. There's one stick, and it can either be used for a raft. Okay, if it's snapped in half, then it's useless to be for the raft, and it's useless as a gig for fishing.
Right. Okay, I'm not trying to be obtuse, but you're giving me an analogy which is a little bit like it's not much to work with here, right? Like,
well, no, it's a thought experiment, and the reason is to elucidate how one establishes what is their property, right? If you make the claim that there is personal property, both of these people have a claim to utilize it towards their own survival. They're not using it to gain, they're not using it to exploit some other person into working for them or whatever, right? They both want this property. Now, conflict has arisen. Now, only libertarianism can resolve this conflict because the libertarianism says the first user principle. The first person said, I like this stick, this is my stick, is the rightful owner of said stick. But under communism...
How is that better than if the two just work together? And is it like in this analogy, can the stick only be used for like one purpose ever?
Well, if it's whittled down into a spear, then it's useless as a raft. And if it's made as part of a raft, then it's useless as a spear for fish.
So you can again, we're in this thought experiment. This stick can be turned into a raft.
The thought experiment is conflict. Conflict occurs over scarce resources. We're both proposing economic models that say this is how we ought distribute scarce resources. The libertarian says that the scarce resources, right, can be solved. The conflict, it can be resolved if argumentation fails, right, which is cooperation that you're talking about. If neither party can agree on what we ought to do with the stick, there is a solution that is conflict reducing, that no longer inherently has conflict baked into it, which we can call an ethical system, which is libertarianism, which says first user principle. Once it is my stick, I can do with the stick as I please, so long as I'm not aggressing upon you. Now, under communism, no such conflict reduction can occur. At some point, force must be initiated to make the party that refuses to use the stick, like it is law of the jungle. Communism says eventually we'll add 3 people, we'll add 4 people. Okay, now we have 4 people on the island and 3 want to use it for a raft and 1 wants to use it for, catching fish. And the 3 say, we outvote you. And then the other guy says, well, no, it's my stick. I found it first. And then eventually, if they can't be convinced, you have to use violence and you have to use power and you have to use control to force that person to go along with whatever the majority position was, because they hold the power. And it is my argument that the socialist model, the framework of not actually establishing private property rights, in an objective way, is the argument of I will use power against you, and I resent you having control over your own property, and I resent your liberty because the outcomes are not what we have decided. We want the preferable outcomes. And that it is just law of the jungle. It is just, I will take what I want by violent means or revolution or whatever, or through a vote in a ballot box where we hold the guns and we say, you have to deal with it because you lost the election.
Okay, to get to the point in society where we'd have, as you say, people coming to consensus and people sharing resources and resources managed in a way that saw all this stuff happen, you would need to obviously have a shift in mindset from what we see today, right? Like a shift in getting used to things being different. And that would be tricky. And as you say, there would be some teething issues. But through that democracy, through that genuine communication and stuff, through people's discursive powers, you have an easier way of people understanding each other's viewpoints and such. Where we fall apart today is in large part because resources are artificially placed on the market, and you must compete and you must fend for yourself, otherwise you're going to be short, and that leads to this false competition where people are needlessly sort of fighting over resources that they could, if they cooperated, come together. It's not insane.
We've already agreed that these resources are scarce, so not everyone can use every resource.
Example, sorry. Are we talking about your analogy?
No, resources.
Or are we talking about real?
No, resources in the world are scarce. There's only so much cobalt. There's only so much
which is
food.
Why they need
There's
to
only
be,
so much.
That's why they need to be organized, and they need to be democratically managed, not left to the market to allow big bucks to come and sweep in and
right. But
turn it into a net enterprise.
Your argument is so long as the majority, is capable of exerting their will and violence upon the minority, then that is the right way to distribute those resources. My argument is that people ought to have the liberty and freedom to do with the property that they homestead, or that they gain through financial means, or that they gain by being the discoverer of said thing, out in the wilderness.
On a market, though. On a market, though, right? On a market, though, this is happening.
What do you mean on a market, though?
Oh, okay, so if we're let's say your vision of society, right, like I take it like a free market, and not in how I was saying earlier, like a proper no state intervention market is left to not corporate entities, to the capitalists, to invest as they see fit and place their resources where they like, and to trade and barter and do all that without anyone intervening, right? And you've got freedom to choose and stuff. Does that take place in has there been some equilibrium? Has there been some resetting? Like where are we entering this from? If that makes sense. Like I don't because if tomorrow the state stepped back and said, right, we hands up, we've messed up, we're going to leave it to the free market. It's all down to you now. Spend with your money. Like Elon Musk still exists, and he's rapidly world's wealthiest man, Jeff Bezos, still exists. You know, these extremely wealthy entities across the massive financial powerhouses exist, right? And now
created by
they,
government.
you know, they've well, helped by the same like wealthy market forces, but they still had their wealth. Like the fact that but so then how is that going to be dealt with, right? Like if you've got people who've got like basically private militias and such, how are they going to be dealt with in this? Like someone says, yeah, it's mine, I've got it first, but they're competing with like some billionaire who has got every financial mean and, let's be honest, extra legal means of sorting him out. You know, that's a nice house you got there. Shame something happened to it.
So I mean, there's a slew of problems with this question, right? So the first problem is fraud exists now. People utilize power to gain ill-gotten gains now. That's how the government fucking works, and that's how corporations that work with the government work. And so this is a distraction from what is the moral argument versus this is a reframing into the pragmatics, right? How do we achieve said society that is now following morality? If I could answer that question, right, I would probably be like a godlike figure. Like if I could answer in every domain, how can we right all of the historical wrongs and rebalance wealth, to where people legitimately gained it, right? Because we'd have to do reparations for slavery. We'd have to do reparations for, the Cherokee that were forcibly walked on the Trail of Tears. We'd have to do, let's talk about Israel and Gaza for a second, right? Like we'd have to go through every single property deed and see who actually originally owned the property and then determine who was a criminal that deserved to be kicked out because there was some type of terrorist, and then who was like a settler that came in and kicked out somebody that legitimately. Yeah, I mean, like we're talking about
been violence.
Right, we're talking about billions of interactions that would have to be adjudicated in some way in order to get to like the perfect null state, right? But I'm not arguing. Which is why what I'm arguing is whether or not that was wrong initially, and by what metric we can say that it is wrong. And then separately, when we're talking about how would we or how ought we structure society in terms of strategics to get us to a better place, like that is like I'm not living in a utopia, right? Like,
but as you've identified that there is that force that has gone into the creation of the state, the house, the private property. That's why the fundamental is addressed in the first place, right? Like the socialist or the communist or whoever says there is a bit of an issue with saying this is mine because it is my private land. I can do whatever profits.
There's no issue with that.
But there is, no issue with that. As you said, there's been some violence to attain that, right? Like,
hold on. You're sneaking in propositions again, right? So we went away from the question. I'll explain. Absolutely. So we went away from the question of how is it that you establish property. And I gave you the libertarian means by which we are able to objectively establish property. And then you went into a pragmatic conversation. And then I had to split and be like, okay, there is a difference between pragmatics and a difference of whether or not the thing was right or wrong to begin with. And then we described the ways in corporations, and there's so many wrongs that have been committed throughout history and much property that billionaires have. Many of them have gotten in horrible ways, or some of it have not even been that bad, like Elon Musk, but he's still gotten government subsidies. We've still had tax money stolen from us so that he could avoid, so that he could have competitive advantage in the electric car market, where he's gotten a lot of money for SpaceX from government funds, etc. And that's money he owes the American taxpayer. But now you are saying, oh, well, you're saying that that Marxism has identified a problem with the person, the first user principle, which is to say they go to an island and then they say, this is my island. This island that I discovered is all mine now. No one else can use it. Except you haven't actually identified a problem there. You've only identified a problem in which some people that have a lot of wealth have gotten so through mechanisms where the government advantaged them over others, or where property was wrongly distributed, or they were given, legal protections so that, they didn't have competitors, et cetera. But you haven't identified any problem with the first user principle or established where personal property comes from.
All right, let's look at that first user principle then. Everyone running around saying,
the meme eater. I appreciate it. It's the logical fallacy that we're talking about is, the sneaking in a proposition into the definition of a word or into an argument.
Okay. Let's go back to that, what we were saying. So the first owner. If everyone in society runs around trying to say, this is mine, I've found this first, I've got this, my private property, there is going to be conflict, right? Because as we've seen, if there's issues with who has got something first, then all of a sudden we have conflict, we have disagreement. In societies that are built on social fabric, unfortunately, that conflict escalates. That leads to serious disagreement and violence and death and such. And especially when we look at the history of wealth expansion, as we mentioned earlier, the indigenous populations of the Americas, quite famously, didn't matter that they were there first. They have been kicked off, led to all sorts of violence against them. Not mentioned in wealth creation today.
Right, don't get too cheeky now. You're fucking British, all right? There's a lot more sins in your history.
Absolutely. That's the sort of point. That's why the fundamental sort of shift away from seeking what is mine and what is our private land and such isn't necessary to move away from into one of more cooperation and collaboration. It's like, let's say this person goes into the island and they find the stick. They have not come into the world through independent ways. They have benefited from the labor and the organization of everyone else around them. So for them to then suddenly vanish off and find the island and say this stick is mine ignores all that has come before it. They should instead think, okay, how can this stick be used to the benefit of society? How can society has produced me, therefore how can I help and improve society? And so
what if they make the wrong choice? So let's say,
that's where democracy comes in, because it's not just them saying yes, time to use this stick. They consult.
So what if the democracy is wrong? What if the democratic decision of how can this best help us, right? So your argument, your argument is a person doesn't come into the world without benefiting from the collective in some way, right?
Yeah.
They're a baby, they're taken care of by their parents. There's, let's say you're in a tribe and there are people that hunt. Okay, well, the baby the mother was able to eat meat so that they could have milk for the baby. So the hunter is owed something in some regard. This purely collective small community is, operating under a system where they have benefited from other people aiding them in some way. And so you use that as the argument as to why a person that is the first user, the first comer to a property, undiscovered stick in the woods, they don't have a right to that stick. That stick is owed to the hunter. That stick is owed to the mother. That stick is owed to the village chief elders. That stick is owed to the village. And you're saying, and I say, how do we figure that out? How you say that what they must do or what they ought to do is what is most beneficial to the tribe with that stick. And then you say, we'll figure it out democratically. But what if half of the people that vote are just straight up retarded? Let's say half the people in the tribe have an IQ of 115 and half the people in the tribe have an IQ of 80. Okay. Do we weight the IQs in the vote? Like, what's going on? Like, what if half the tribe?
Not something that IQ is not something we need to take seriously. Firstly, but secondly,
hold on. What the IQ? So psychology can be regarded. Do you believe in this psychology discovered anything helpful?
Okay. In terms of what we're doing with this stick, obviously you'd be consulting people who are like if it's like what is the best tool to make? You consult with people who can use tools. You're not going to just ask a random person if it's like just something that is specific into their their sector, their field.
How do we know that it ought to be a tool?
Well, exactly. You're consulting with people. The point is, you're consulting with academic types and people who work with the land, and you're consulting with people who would ask what is the best thing to do with this. You're not just taking it for yourself and hoarding it in some private stash, and then later saying, "Well, it's my property, so I'm going to make whatever money source I can use with it." Right? Like.
Well, no, I would say that's the morally righteous thing to do, that your situation is immoral. So I wouldn't agree to that.
Why? Okay, but...
Well, I described it already. Because you don't have a system of ethics. You have a system of violence and bullying, where the community
How is it violence and bullying?
because a conflict occurred, and the means by which the conflict over scarce resources. I want to use this stick to do A. Everyone else wants to use the stick to do B. We are in a conflict over scarce resources. We don't agree on how best to use the stick, and then you're saying we will resolve this conflict via democracy. But what is in the proposition of democracy, of voting on what to do, is A, that there are losers in this proposition. There are people that want to use the stick towards opposing means from the other people, and they get told you're in the minority, so you don't get to do what you want to do. You do what we tell you to do, or else.
The fact that you found a stick doesn't automatically make it your stick. Like the land, it doesn't. Like in this system, land doesn't have inherent owners, does it? It's just land. And so, as we're all of the land, as we're all of Earth, in a better system, we would see that resources, when managed democratically, can go to a social benefit.
This is mysticism.
There's
it's mysticism. We are of the land, and therefore land doesn't have an owner. This is mysticism. This isn't an argument. There's no rationality behind we are of the land. Okay, like we can hug trees all we want, and we can fucking sing kumbaya, but that's not an argument as to what to do with scarce resources when we have individuals that want to use scarce resources towards opposing means.
Why should you?
My system is conflict reducing. It does not induce conflict. Your system induces conflict.
Reducing?
Because there is an answer to the quandary of what do we do with the stick? And the answer to the quandary of what do we do with the stick is the person who discovered the stick and who claimed the stick and argued intersubjectively that it is their property is the person that owns that stick. And now they don't need permission from someone else. They don't need someone else to tell them what they can or can't do with the stick. They do with the stick as they so please. There is no longer a conflict because, other people may want to use that stick, but there is a means by which we can establish who is the rightful owner of the stick and how that stick ought to be used. The communist system we will vote on it is conflict inducing insofar as anytime someone disagrees, they're voted out and they're forced to just accept the consequences of that disagreement because the majority told them that they were wrong. And then they're threatened with violence or banishment or something.
How did you find the stick, Ben? How did you find in this example? How did you find the stick?
Are we on the island or are we the tribe?
Either. You can choose.
All right, I'm in the tribe. I went out in the woods. I found a good stick. Wow, that's a great stick. I want to use that stick.
And how did you? How did this come into being? How did this happen?
What do you mean? How did this happen? You walked out into the woods and you found a stick.
And you're just you're you as now, like a grown man. You're clothed. You've got communicative skills. You've come into the world, right?
Sure.
So you've interacted with society through that. Like you're not just like when we're saying tribe. Are you thinking like literally like 10,000 BC? We're like are we thinking like if it was now? Like what's?
I mean, there are tribes that exist today. You know what I mean?
Okay, but are we? Of course. But are we contemporary? Like,
we're simplifying. We're simplifying it, right? Like if it gets overly complex, we're talking about a city of 120,000 people, right? I'm using the tribe example or the island example because these are simpler examples that allow us to illuminate the actual founding, the philosophy behind it.
You're in the tribe, you and 100 people or so, maybe not even that, maybe like 20. But there's a tribe. You go into the woods, you find a stick. You say it's my stick. The tribe say, well, hang on a second. We've raised you. You benefit from being around all of us. You've got all this stuff, with us. Why should it be just yours? Why can't we decide democratically? And I mean, it's a bit strange that there's only one stick, but sure, let's say for this example there is. It's scarce.
So
why is it just yours?
All right, I'm a 16-year-old boy, or I'm an 18-year-old boy, right? So we don't get into weird age of consent shit, right? I'm an 18-year-old man, all right? Now, the argument is because people aided me in living in the tribe, right? I don't have a right to property that I find out there. So I need the permission of the entirety of the tribe. Now, in order to not be conflict-inducing, Everyone in the tribe must agree with what to do with the stick. We must all come to consensus. If we don't come to a perfect consensus where every single member of the tribe, let's say there's 20 people, 19 people say we ought to use the stick to do this, and one person says we ought to use the stick to do another thing, right? Now that person is a loser. They have lost in their ability to vote. They had the ability to vote, but they lost the vote. So there is a conflict that is maintained in this. Right? And you're saying, but that's okay because everybody worked towards me. So my question to you is, did they do so voluntarily or did they do so against their will?
Like, they've done it. If in this situation, like the tribe, in terms of them raising you.
Yeah, did they raise me voluntarily, or did they do so out of fear that they might be killed or banished from the tribe, or were they coerced into helping me?
Well, I mean, if it's a tribe, then presumably it's their ethics, isn't it? But if we're talking markets, like then
no.
Sorry, I'm slightly lost with our analogies here. Sorry.
You're saying that I owe the stick to others because they aided me. My question is, did they aid me in my upbringing voluntarily, or did they aid me against their will?
Is it my choice? Is it my choosing?
So they did so voluntarily, right?
No, I'm asking, like, what have I got the choice to say whether it's one or the other, or am I saying, like, what is? I'm slightly lost with what you're saying here. Sorry.
Were they forced to aid me? Were they forced to take care of me, where they did not have a choice? Someone would come in and give them a coercive punishment of some sort. If they did not aid me, they would be banished from the tribe to die in the woods alone, or they would be punished by like flogging, whatever the fucking punishment is. Did they aid me because they wanted to aid me and they wanted to help me, or did they aid me because they were forced into it?
It's a bit of both, right? I mean, they probably like and care.
Okay, so there's an element,
but they also need to have people like, if they hadn't raised you, you wouldn't be a member of a tribe able to help the rest of the tribe. So there'd be like an element of falls apart, right? So
the element of voluntary is not an issue here, right? Because if they voluntarily aided me, then then there's no reason that I can't voluntarily do what I so choose to do. Now, the element of coercion here is of particular interest. So because people were coerced into taking care of me, I must now repeat the cycle of coercion. By what means, if it's all purely voluntary and I go out and do a stick, right? And if they say you can't do with the stick what you want to do with the stick, now we have introduced the element of coercion. We have gone from a purely voluntary society where people were helping me just because I was a cute kid and they liked me, whatever, right? And now we're introducing coercion that says you must do this or else. If we were already living in a society that was you must do this or else, we need to backtrack and say, why was it morally or ethically right to coerce people into going against their free will and to going against their liberty to take care of me or to make me part of the tribe? And we go back 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 over and over and over again. This becomes an unanswerable question of why, like where the initial coercion kicks. Okay, so why is it?
Humans should look after other humans. Humans should care about other people. We should care about the other people we surround ourselves with.
Yeah, I don't disagree that humans ought care about other humans, but that's a completely separate thing from whether or not they have a right to coerce my behavior. They have a right to tell me that I can no longer do what I want to do with my body. I went out, I found a stick, I want to whittle the stick into something. And they're saying, you don't have that right. You're not allowed to use your knife and your limbs in that way because you're destroying the communal property. Why is past coercion justify current coercion?
If it's a scarce object, if it was like one of the only sticks around, because I think in my mind, like we're in a forest and they're fighting over one stick.
It's a perfect stick. Every man knows what the perfect stick is. Don't pretend like you haven't watched a YouTube video and saw a stick and been like, "Ooh, that's a good stick." We all fucking know if you have a fucking Y chromosome, we all know when you see the perfect stick, like, oh shit, that's a rare stick, okay? It's one of those dope ass sticks where everyone is like, cool fucking stick, all right? Don't play pretend with me. You know what a good stick is.
Sure. Okay. We'll pretend that it's it's a proper stick. It's what there's you could use it into like a proper
Make it British that shit up. It's a proper stick. Yeah, it is. All right, let's go.
Sure. It's gonna have some value to more than just you, right? Like maybe this stick could be used as like a proper, you've been using some rubbishy old falling apart hammer to get things done. Now you've got a big like mallet to whack things on with. Maybe you love sport and you need a proper bat, and this is the best one. But the point is, it affects more than just you, because it's not just you who lives it, right? It's the whole tribe. Everyone is affected by what this place is, what this item is. And so for you to say no, it's mine for me to do as I see fit because I found it first, invites a mode of competition and of conflict into itself. Maybe then the person who has in the tribe maintaining the fire says, well, I actually collected all this firewood. I'm not getting.
Okay.
Maybe as is your name what Fabian? Is it?
Well, my name's Scott. It's fine.
Scott. Sorry, Scott. They said, well, Scott, you've got that stick for yourself, and you're not showing that. Well, you're gonna have to compensate me for this fire. And then the next guy says, well, I've got these.
I think I get what you're saying. I get what you're saying. And so I want to be honest with you, right? Because I do try and be as good faith as possible, right? But I did play a little bit of a trick on you, right? And so I'm going to reveal the trick that I put on you. Is about 30 minutes ago, we were discussing the difference between personal property and private property. And you attempted to make this about, about there being an actual distinction between personal and private property. And I told you that you wouldn't actually be able to differentiate the difference between personal and private property. And you scoffed at that. And we had a conversation about toothbrushes and about how a multitude or a toothbrush shop is different. And so what I did is I did thought experiments intentionally at the individual level on the island and then at the tribal level. And I walked you into proving that you actually can't make the distinction between personal and private property, because even a single fucking stick in the woods is owned by the tribe, and you don't have the right to use a single fucking stick in the woods as you see fit. So I appreciate your time and consideration on this.
Okay, but you said that the stick was scarce. Obviously, sticks aren't.
All resources are scarce.
Okay, but in the tribe example you gave, like a tribe has many, many sticks, and so it wouldn't be an issue for you to have one. If there were a finite, like as in not thousands of sticks, if there were like only a handful of sticks, then it's well within the rights of the tribe to say, no, we need to think about what we're doing with this stick. You can't just hire it for yourself. Okay, let's use another example.
But in not using it for personal profit or gain or any of those other modifiers that you put in before, right? Like once I revealed the illusion to you and I pulled the wool from your eyes and showed you what I had done, is that you couldn't make that differentiation. Now we add this new domain of, but the steak is especially scarce. It's more scarce than other scarcity. And because it's more scarce, that's the real distinction. So again, this makes no sense if we go back to toothbrushes, because some people can have a $200 toothbrush that is really, really nice and, has like squirts out water and, water flosses very well. And some people get cheap $2 toothbrushes at Walmart. And so the same stick analogy would be the same thing, is that I'm not allowed to have my $200 toothbrush that's actually a super dope toothbrush because it's a rare and really good toothbrush.
In a democratically organized society, the toothbrush distribution could be sorted out fairly, right? Ultimately, the fact that some toothbrushes are more fancy than others wouldn't. Ultimately, you can still brush your teeth with a less fancy toothbrush. All the fancier one is doing is simplifying the process, right? You could still distribute toothbrushes in a way that ensure that everyone's got access to it and achieve that. The stick situation.
It's a
The
proper
nice
stick.
stick.
It's a dope stick. It's a stick that multiple people want because
Sure.
it's a better
So,
stick. That doesn't. We
yes.
both agree
And
that there
then
are other sticks. We both agree that there are other toothbrushes, but the toothbrush in question is a really nice toothbrush that is more efficacious than other toothbrushes.
Nice. So
It's
it
the same
becomes
analogy.
something that is so structurally organized. You'd work out where it's most suitable to distribute those nice toothbrushes to, and get them there. You wouldn't say, well, we've put this massive price on it, so if you're rich, then great. If you can't afford it, too bad. Have the ones that are cheaply made and fall apart. In fact, you'd improve the whole process of making toothbrushes because you no longer have a profit motive for people, for um,
That
some
is
Billy Big
that
Bucks
might be
making it.
that might be the wildest claim I've ever heard, which is that if we
Really?
socialize the production of making toothbrushes, we would get more efficient at making toothbrushes. Both history,
Absolutely.
all of the data, and the philosophy do not support the conclusion that nationalized or socialized industries where people are forced to labor in toothbrush factories is going to make the process cheaper and more efficient. The market is unbelievably better than state planning at providing goods and resources and services, however you want to define those terms, than nationalized industries. Like that's you're not going to find an economist worth his salt in any domain that would make that claim unless they are an avowed Marxist. Any
talking
economist
about
from
in
like
this
a Keynesian, a Chicago school,
this
an
world, right?
Austrian, you're not going to find that. Like there's no data or philosophy that supports that other than Marxism just saying magically true.
Not magically true. In this world we live in right now, which is a market-based world, we live in a free market of varying stripes. Are you don't like it being called a free market because it's not technically free. Sure, it still has those market principles, right? So countries which in the past have tried to nationalize various elements of their society in production and such have always still had to compete with those private entities who have a direct interest in taking over nationalized goods and nationalized resources. And as we said earlier, those wealthy entities also operate in governments and so have an interest in defunding national programs and making the spending power worse and essentially making it so that they have better means to take over more, to expand their capital. So the idea that someone would point to some struggling national entity and say, well, this is why we can't ever leave the free market because profit is, we must use profit as our driving factor is bad. And then twofold, and secondly, the idea that production is going fine right now with a profit motive is not true. Like, we look at the amount of waste our planet is producing, look at the terrible management of resources, the fact that stuff is binned without it even reaching people who could probably use it, the enforced poverty. We could go on. I've realised, by the way, that it is 1:35 in the UK. So if as lovely as it has been talking to you, and it has been interesting.
We should do it again sometime. I'll ask you.
Yeah.
I'll ask you one question, right, and then
Go for it.
because I'm just curious as to what you might think. What do you think are all of the inputs that go into making a toothbrush? Like, if you had to guess.
So, like the resources and such. So
Yeah.
obviously need to get the material to produce the brush. If it's plastic, that's going to come from various synthetic processes. If it's a wooden one, then that's coming from more natural ones, but it's still quite a bit that goes into it. The division of labor is quite broad. Lots and lots of stuff. It needs to be shipped over to the shop, needs to be taken to the shop via someone driving it from the docks to the shop front, needs to be packaged, all of it. Tons of stuff, of course.
Yeah. I was just curious, and because I thought it was an interesting question about the the problem of central planning because of how complicated it is. And I was just curious as to like what Grok would say. Obviously it's AI, so take it with a grain of salt, but that seems to make sense. They gave a fairly succinct response, which was plastic for the handle, which includes colorants, stabilizers, plasticizers, bristles, nylon,
Yep.
Nylon 6, Nylon 6-6, packaging materials, which is a whole list of things that have to come from different countries, metal that is optional in all of those places. I think there's like 7 steps under manufacturing equipment, labor, energy, water, chemicals and ancillary materials, design and development inputs, packaging and branding, logistics and distribution, marketing and sales. Now that part you might not have to do in a centrally planned economy. Regulatory compliance and inputs, that part would be a lot more in a centrally planned economy. And then of course a whole giant list of miscellaneous inputs. The point being that I was just curious as to what level of complexity we were thinking of, like, state managing the market economy and how that would be more efficient. It's just like such a wild claim.
Democratic, sorry?
Well, it's just such a wild claim. The idea that the market is less efficient than the state at producing materials and what
goods. Say it was as we exist today, where market has when we have a market as all interaction, like all everything we have comes through a market now. But that doesn't mean that things couldn't be better in a different organization, and we couldn't eliminate many of the flaws. But we're seeing in today's market-based structures and such. Obviously, it's complex.
Philosophically,
I would never
it's
say
impossible. The price mechanism is just.
It would take a big step. It would take a huge leap from where we are now.
Oh no! I mean, it's literally impossible.
No way. Anything is possible if we try. Yeah?
Yeah, all things are possible through Jesus. So jot that one down, boys.
But it's true. No? There's no. I mean, can you imagine saying to someone in 1700, that in a few generations' time, it would no longer be a serf to the land? You imagine saying to someone in 1900, we're going to have instant communication with someone on the other side of the planet. There's all what
or
our
telling someone
is.
Yeah, I mean, or telling someone now that in 100 years they won't have to pay taxes. But hopefully I'm right on that one. I appreciate you coming here. It was a fun little chit chat. I got to get into a reaction. I got some other stuff I want to do, and who knows how much that will get done tonight, because this conversation did run long. Let people know where they can find you or follow you.
How long have we? 2 hours. Sorry.
Yeah, just let people know where they can find you and what you're about or whatever, so that they can.
Sure. I mean, I wouldn't say I'm as serious. Devoted is the wrong word. I'm not as organized as you are with your streams and such, but I am on YouTube. I am on Twitter, but I don't really use it as much anymore. If you want to, if you're in the chat and you're thinking, "Wow, I don't agree with this guy at all. He's talking rubbish," happy to chat with any of them as well, any of your fans as well. But no, it's I'm very grateful for having time to talk to you. And yeah, perhaps at some point we'll do a part 2. You take care. Right. Enjoy your evening. And it must be what, like 9 in America where you are at the moment?
Yeah, it's almost 9. We got some more stuff to do.
A bit of time, eh? Right, you take care. See you in a bit.
All right, peace.